Welcome to Sleepy Tales, a place where myths, legends, and ancient stories are told slowly and softly to help you drift into a peaceful sleep. Before we begin, I'd love for you to share where you're from and what time it is where you are. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel, and if you enjoy relaxing stories, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a night of our peaceful tales. Now, settle in, relax, and allow tonight's bedtime story carry you into sleep.
Tonight, we are going to explore the story of Poseidon, where the waves are moody, and the only thing deeper than the ocean is his need for attention. Poseidon, god of the seas and earthquakes, was a little unpredictable. While Zeus got all the thunderbolt glory, Poseidon was out there causing chaos in his own special way, like sinking ships and stirring up storms, just to keep things interesting. But as it turns out, mortals don't exactly want to worship a god who might flood their village on a whim. Son of Cronus, the aquatic middle child. Before Poseidon became the unpredictable, moody god of the sea, earthquakes, and the occasional horse, he was just another kid born into the mess that was the Olympian family. And if you think your family dynamics are complicated, imagine being born into a clan of divine beings who could destroy mountains for fun, and whose father thought eating his children was a valid parenting method. Good times. Let's start with Cronus, Poseidon's father. Cronus wasn't exactly a model father figure. He had a bit of a control issue, stemming from an ominous prophecy. One of your children will overthrow you. In response, he did what any rational deity would do. He swallowed each of his kids as soon as they were born. After all, if you can't defeat a prophecy, you can at least defeat the children responsible for it. A little on the nose, but we get it, Cronus. So, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon, one by one, found themselves swallowed by dear old dad. And I'd like to think they probably formed a sort of family support group inside Cronus's stomach, offering advice like, "You should have seen the look on his face when he realised he was swallowing his own child." There's a lot of bonding that can happen when you're all stuck in a cramped digestive tract, especially when your father is eating you like a slightly unhinged version of the Greek equivalent of fast food. But before you start thinking, how bad could it be? At least they're safe in there. Consider this. They're all hanging out, trapped, but they know it's not forever. And when Zeus, the youngest, managed to escape this fate, thanks to Rhea, the mother who had finally had enough of Cronus's dietary choices, things started to change. Zeus grew up in hiding, returned with some handy magic and a furious sense of justice, and freed his siblings in a rather dramatic fashion. Cronus had a moment of realising, oh, this wasn't a good plan, but there were no takebacks. So, out they came, Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades and Poseidon, one by one, bursting forth like a weirdly familial magic show. There was likely some awkwardness when they first emerged. One sibling coughs and says, "Ugh, the taste of rock is worse than I thought." And the others nod in a universal understanding that being eaten by one's father isn't exactly a bonding experience. Now, Zeus, ever the overachiever, didn't just settle for getting out of the stomach of doom and moving on. He had a plan. Overthrow Cronus, beat up all the Titans, and probably pick up some cool weapons on the way. After a lot of intense sibling collaboration, Zeus and his crew managed to defeat the Titans in what's known as the Titanomachy, a 10-year-long war of epic proportions. 10 years. So, while the Titans were figuring out how to regroup, the Olympians were throwing the ultimate tantrum, like a divine episode of Survivor, only with fewer fire challenges and more actual fire. Poseidon, being an integral part of this little family revolution, wasn't just the backup player. He was equipped with a weapon from the Cyclopes, a trident, which was essentially a fancy fork with a lot more destructive potential. Now, Poseidon could really make waves. And when I say waves, I mean literal ones. Tidal, oceanic, ship-sinking waves that could ruin your entire afternoon. When the Titans were finally defeated, the Olympians gathered like kids dividing up the last piece of birthday cake. Only instead of cake, they were divvying up the entire world. And guess who got the sea? Poseidon, the sea. It was a big deal, huge. After all, the sea is vast, mysterious, and very prone to tantrums. It made sense for Poseidon to take it, though I'm guessing there was a little resentment because while the sea is impressive, it's not exactly the top tier choice like, say, the sky, which Zeus took, or the underworld, which Hades snagged. Poseidon got the saltwater domain, where he could rule all the fish and create tsunamis when he was in a particularly bad mood. In fact, while everyone else was dealing with politics and the day-to-day of ruling the known world, Poseidon was probably getting a little annoyed about the whole being stuck with the sea thing. Yes, the sea was powerful, yes, it was vast, but did anyone really think about the logistics? You can't exactly sit on a throne in the middle of the ocean and have a meeting about celestial matters, can you? Poseidon was likely left out of a lot of the family meetings that Zeus and Hades could attend. You know, sibling stuff. Zeus was probably like, "Don't you worry, Poseidon, we'll take care of the land stuff, and you just keep whatever it is you do with waves." The sea is unpredictable, which is probably an understatement. You can never plan for the sea's bad days. 1 minute, it's a serene blue expanse, and the next you're looking at a storm that could wipe out an entire coastal village. Poseidon had power, yes, but also an ever-growing complex about his role in the family. Let's be honest, when you're the god of the sea, it's hard not to have some emotional baggage about how people view you. Sure, you could drown a city with a bad mood, but that doesn't exactly lead to warm family dinners. It's like being the one god who's always a little bit too literal and too intense for the relaxed crowd. Speaking of his domain, Poseidon's underwater palace was nothing short of magnificent. Picture it, an ethereal castle made of coral, seashells, and glittering gemstones. You'd think that living in a world of salt water might lead to some discomfort, but Poseidon was so used to it by now that the perpetual dampness didn't faze him. To be fair, what else was he going to do? Build a land-based condo and complain about the view? Despite the allure of his majestic underwater kingdom, Poseidon wasn't content with just being the god of the ocean. He wanted more. After all, there's only so much one can do with a never-ending sea. Sometimes he would look at his siblings, who had grand temples built for them on land, and he'd have a thought, why not me? So Poseidon would throw himself into tasks to prove himself, like trying to win over Athens, until Athena swooped in and left him holding the salty bag of, well, salt water. In the grand scheme of things, Poseidon remained an important figure in the Olympian lineup. He was a god of wild power, earth-shattering, sea-calming, storm-stirring power. But being the god of the ocean, while awesome, meant that people couldn't always see him as clearly as they saw the more approachable gods like Zeus or Athena. And so Poseidon brooded. And when Poseidon brooded, he wasn't afraid to show it. If you're having a conversation with Zeus, and suddenly the ocean rises up to swallow a few boats, you know Poseidon's feeling a little ignored. And to be honest, he wasn't always above using his power for petty retribution, as evidenced by his endless spats with various mortals, heroes, and occasionally even gods. He wasn't evil, he just had feelings, and sometimes those feelings involved very large storms and a tendency to flood things. Zeus may have ruled the heavens, but Poseidon ruled the vast, uncontrollable expanse of water that people feared, respected, and frankly didn't understand. When they wanted peace, Poseidon gave them calm seas. When they angered him, they learned how little they truly controlled their fates. So, Poseidon's journey as the god of the sea began not with grand triumphs, but with a sense of reluctant responsibility. As we see, Poseidon wasn't born with the cushiest role in the Olympian family. He was the middle child, the one who got the leftovers. But while others looked up and ruled the sky, Poseidon dug deep into the earth, sank into the oceans, and started his own slow but steady climb to greatness. Building Atlantis and other projects that end in floods. After Poseidon reluctantly inherited the oceans, earthquakes and horses, more on the horses later, you might think that he'd sit back, relax, and enjoy a life of endless tides and calm seas. But like any god struggling with middle child syndrome, Poseidon wasn't content with just doing the bare minimum. No, he needed a project, a legacy. And what better way to leave your mark on the world than to build a city that could stand the test of time, right? Enter Atlantis, Poseidon's grandest architectural disaster, and quite possibly the most ambitious and misunderstood construction project in all of ancient mythology. Now, before we go any further, let's clarify one thing. Building an entire city under the ocean wasn't as glamorous as it sounds. Sure, Poseidon had the power to control the waters, manipulate the earth, and essentially create a city that would make even the most awe-inspiring civilizations look like sandcastles. But when you're living in a realm that's mostly wet, salty, and prone to natural disasters, your choice of real estate is limited. It's like deciding to build a mansion on top of a constantly erupting volcano and then being surprised when things don't go well. It's possible, but only if you're Poseidon and you're convinced you can make it work. So Poseidon set out to build Atlantis, an island city that would be the envy of the world. Of course, the gods weren't really known for their ability to plan things through. Poseidon may have had an army of sea creatures at his disposal, but construction projects aren't the same as creating massive tidal waves. Building a thriving metropolis wasn't just about flooding a couple of boats and sending a few whales to help with the heavy lifting. No, it took planning, coordination, and most importantly, patience. Unfortunately, Poseidon had about as much patience as a toddler in a candy store. Nevertheless, the idea of Atlantis was grand. The city was meant to be an architectural marvel, with lush gardens, golden streets, and palaces made from coral and precious stones. Poseidon was going all out, using his powers to command the earth and sea to create the perfect island, one that could serve as a beacon of his creativity and might. But, as you might expect, Poseidon's vision for Atlantis was ambitious. So ambitious, in fact, that he never really stopped to think about a few minor details, like the fact that the ocean is, well, kind of unpredictable. In classic Poseidon fashion, the moment Atlantis was completed, things started to go wrong. And not just a little wrong, things went catastrophically wrong. The city, which was meant to be a triumph, quickly turned into Poseidon's very own white whale. Sure, the palace was beautiful, the gardens were stunning, and the streets shimmered like gold in the sun. But soon after the final stone was laid and the last coral archway was finished, the ocean, Poseidon's beloved domain, decided that it wasn't impressed. And when the ocean doesn't like something, it has one simple solution: flooding. The first flood came like a casual disagreement, a little water spilling over the edges of Atlantis' man-made boundaries. Poseidon, being Poseidon, probably just muttered something along the lines of, "I'll fix that later," and then sent a few sea creatures to clean up the mess. But then, in a bold decision that could only be described as tragically ironic, Poseidon decided that he needed to show off a little bit. He began altering the very foundations of Atlantis, creating greater canals, more impressive structures, and perhaps adding an unnecessary number of decorative fountains. And once again, the ocean, the thing that Poseidon had so thoroughly tamed, decided to rise up and flood everything. And so, Atlantis was consumed by the sea. Some say it was a punishment. Others say it was a natural consequence of building a city on top of the ocean. Poseidon, with all his godly wisdom, likely could have used a few basic principles of structural integrity, like, say, not building a metropolis on a giant sandbar in the middle of an unpredictable ocean. But that's what happens when you're trying to get a little creative with the world's most volatile substance. But Poseidon wasn't about to let one catastrophic project put a damper on his work ethic. In fact, he would go on to have many other such projects that ended, unsurprisingly, in natural disasters. One such venture, however, would become far more famous than Atlantis. That project was horses. That's right, Poseidon invented horses. Well, not exactly invented them, but he did create the first horses out of sea foam, which is a little like saying you invented the bike because you made the wheels but forgot to put a seat on them. Horses weren't quite what Poseidon was expecting. He was going for something magnificent, something that would match his oceanic grandeur. Instead, he created what could only be described as equine chaos. When Poseidon first created the horses, he was expecting to impress everyone, and they were impressive, don't get me wrong. Horses are magnificent creatures, majestic and strong, but Poseidon, in typical Poseidon fashion, got a little too carried away with his vision. Instead of making a couple of majestic steeds that could gallop gracefully through the waters, which would have been a perfectly acceptable innovation, Poseidon created horses that were fast, wild, and unpredictable. He gave them the speed of the wind, the power of the ocean, and the fury of a god who's a little too frustrated with his own lack of control. Needless to say, the horses weren't exactly well received by mortals, who had no idea how to handle these creatures. Poseidon, of course, didn't care. He had created them for his own amusement, and that was enough. To add insult to injury, Poseidon gave these horses to various mortals as gifts, and when they didn't treat the horses with the reverence they deserved, Poseidon did what any god would do. He cursed them. Yes, the horses were cursed, which, to be honest, feels a little bit like adding a dangerous weapon to a new hobby and then getting angry when people use it irresponsibly. It's safe to say that Poseidon's ventures weren't exactly known for their longevity. Whether it was Atlantis, his horses, or his frequent efforts to improve or alter the seas, things never quite turned out as planned. And while some may point to Poseidon's visionary spirit, others might suggest that he had a bit of a lack of foresight problem. Every project Poseidon undertook was grand, ambitious, and in constant danger of being swept away by the very forces he controlled. It's as if Poseidon had an ongoing internal conflict. On one hand, he was powerful and creative, constantly striving for greatness. On the other, he was also a little bit reckless, a little too quick to act on impulse without thinking things through. The fact that Poseidon's most ambitious creations usually ended in destruction only added to his complicated personality. He was never evil, per se. He just had a certain way of expressing his frustrations with the world. Sure, he ruled the seas and controlled the earth's movements, but that didn't mean he was good at managing his own empire of water. Poseidon's legacy was cemented as one of both awe and mild concern. He became the god of the seas and the ruler of earthquakes, sure, but also the god who created things with grand visions, only to have them swallowed by the very waters he commanded. Atlantis, once a shimmering dream of architectural glory, sank into the ocean as if the sea was giving a rather dramatic no thank you. His horses too galloped off into chaos, more trouble than they were worth. Poseidon, ever the optimist, was never discouraged by his failures. After all, what's a little flooding between gods? But if there's one thing Poseidon knew for sure, it's that his grand ideas were destined for a washout, quite literally. And yet, with every new project, he couldn't help but dive back in, because what was a god of the sea to do but keep trying? Besides, there was always something else to flood, or build. The many loves and even more offspring of Poseidon. By now, you've probably come to realise that Poseidon's talents weren't just limited to architectural disasters and the occasional flood. No, as the god of the sea, he was also quite the ladies' man. After all, when you control the oceans, cause earthquakes, and can turn the land into watery chaos with a swipe of your trident, you're bound to attract attention. And apparently, Poseidon didn't just attract attention, he attracted everyone. You might think that the gods of Mount Olympus would spend their time philosophizing or attending eternal cocktail parties. But no, Poseidon had more pressing matters on his mind. And when a god like him sets his sights on something, it's usually a lot of something. His romantic exploits became legendary, not just for their sheer volume, but for the even more legendary offspring that resulted from them. Poseidon was, in short, the ancient world's answer to an enthusiastic, yet somewhat irresponsible single father. Let's start with the basics. Poseidon wasn't exactly the one and done type. No, his love life was an ongoing saga, like a soap opera, except instead of dramatic confrontations and tearful monologues, it was mostly just watery chaos and the birth of many, many children. To begin, Poseidon had a tendency to fall in love in the most inconvenient ways possible. If there was a beautiful mortal, a lovely nymph, or a goddess with a particularly good reputation, you could bet Poseidon would be swooping in, possibly on a chariot drawn by horses he had invented, and saying something along the lines of, "Hey, I'm the god of the ocean. Want to take a swim in the seas?" And because Poseidon was a god, and let's face it, probably a little charming when he wasn't flooding things, a lot of people said yes. His first notable romance was with Amphitrite, a sea nymph. She was exactly what you'd expect. Graceful, mysterious, and probably a little put off by the fact that Poseidon couldn't keep his hands off the waves. Amphitrite had a bit of a not interested attitude when Poseidon first tried to woo her. She ran away to the farthest reaches of the ocean, not exactly wanting to be swept off her feet by the trident-wielding god. But Poseidon, being Poseidon, wasn't the type to take no for an answer. He sent dolphins, yes, dolphins, to find her and convince her that he was really serious about this whole marriage thing. Eventually, Amphitrite agreed to become Poseidon's wife, which, let's be honest, was probably the first "I can't believe I did this" moment of many in their relationship. Their union, though somewhat obligatory, produced a number of children. These weren't just any children, mind you. They were the offspring of the god of the sea, which meant they were a bit special. Their firstborn was Triton, a merman who, despite his aquatic heritage, probably found himself spending more time trying to explain his father's personality than actually ruling the seas. We're not sure if Triton had a sense of humour, but it's safe to assume he did after growing up under Poseidon's rather chaotic reign. While Amphitrite was Poseidon's official partner, and probably the only one who got some semblance of attention, Poseidon also had an extensive portfolio of one-night stands, many of which resulted in even more children. These relationships, for the most part, were less about romance and more about Poseidon's inability to keep his trident to himself. Take Medusa, for example. Medusa, who was later transformed into a monster by Athena, long story, was once a beautiful mortal woman. Poseidon, upon seeing her, found her beauty to be, let's say, irresistible. As was the custom with Poseidon, his feelings of admiration were quickly translated into action, regardless of whether the person in question was interested. And so, Medusa, in a somewhat tragic turn of events, became one of Poseidon's many unfortunate romantic entanglements. In fact, this relationship led to the birth of Pegasus, the famous winged horse. If there's one thing we can say about Poseidon's love life, it's that it often gave birth to interesting creatures, whether the world was ready for them or not. But Medusa wasn't the only one. Poseidon's love life was a bit like a grocery list, long, filled with different types of items, and constantly being updated. There was Demeter, with whom Poseidon had an affair that produced a daughter named Despoina, which, to be fair, is a much better name than "I'm still not sure why I'm here." And there was Aphrodite, the goddess of love, whose relationship with Poseidon seemed like the most complicated friends with benefits situation in the entire pantheon. Poseidon also had flings with a variety of nymphs, including Thessalonike, a Macedonian nymph who, much like everyone else, found herself swept into the whirlwind that was Poseidon's love life. This pattern of enthusiastic, often chaotic romances resulted in a sea of children, literal and metaphorical. Some of them were gods, Some of them were monsters, and some of them were just there. Let's just say Poseidon didn't exactly check the fine print when it came to his relationships. A lot of the time, he was just in the moment, enjoying the fact that he could turn into a whirlwind of desire and, well, other things. Now, it's important to note that Poseidon's lovers, though often swept up in his grand gestures, weren't exactly in it for the long haul. And by long haul, we mean survival. You see, Poseidon wasn't exactly the best at keeping things peaceful. When you're a god of the sea, emotions can run high, and Poseidon, though undoubtedly passionate, had a habit of letting things get a little out of hand. His lovers, nymphs and mortals alike, often found themselves at the receiving end of over-enthusiastic gestures. A romantic evening with Poseidon could quickly turn into a tidal wave of affection. Literally. Take Scylla, for example. Scylla, once a beautiful nymph, caught Poseidon's eye while she was swimming near his domain. Poseidon, thinking she was a fine catch, who wouldn't be flattered by his attention, decided to bless her with a special gift. The gift turned out to be a horrible transformation that turned her into a hideous monster with 12 legs and 6 heads. So much for the smooth moves of a god. Poseidon's idea of romance often ended with his lovers finding themselves in rather unfortunate circumstances where the sea was the only thing that would ever truly take them. Then there was Charybdis, a woman whom Poseidon, in his infinite wisdom, decided to transform into a giant whirlpool. This transformation was certainly memorable, but not exactly a model for healthy relationships. A whirlpool, while certainly effective at cleaning up trash or sinking ships, isn't exactly what you'd call romantic. The truth is, Poseidon had so many offspring that it's honestly a bit difficult to keep track. Some were gods and goddesses, others were creatures of the deep, like the aforementioned monsters. And of course, as his many romantic entanglements suggest, these children weren't always conveniently placed in a neat family tree. Some were conceived with mortals, others with nymphs, and a few with goddesses, all of whom had their own very complicated relationships with the sea god. He didn't just have 1 or 2 kids who became heroes or famous figures. No, Poseidon's children were legion, a sea of personalities, some of which you probably didn't even know existed until now. By now, you might have come to the conclusion that Poseidon wasn't just a god of the seas, he was also a god of complicated family trees, blessed with an unfortunate ability to create creatures, both magnificent and monstrous. And while he never stopped trying to manage his ever-growing brood, you could say he was probably just happy that he had a way of making sure there was always something new in the world. Whether it was a new storm, or a new sea creature, or, yes, a new child. Poseidon's hobbies: wrath, salt water, and earthquakes. Poseidon, for all his sea-spanning exploits, wasn't just a master of romance, watery chaos, and the occasional architectural failure. No, the god of the seas also had some rather interesting hobbies. While some gods enjoyed fine arts, philosophy, or strategic warfare, Poseidon's interests were a little more, well, destructive. If you were looking for a god who could not only stir the seas but also break things, Poseidon was your man. Most people, when they think of hobbies, imagine something calm. Reading a book, painting, perhaps knitting. Poseidon, however, was not interested in knitting. He was far too busy for that. His hobbies were a bit more along the lines of shaking the earth, flooding cities, and making sure that no coastline was safe from his whims. His favourite pastime, of course, was showing off how utterly terrifying he could be when he wasn't busy trying to drown the entire mortal world. Let's talk about Poseidon's first and most beloved hobby, earthquakes. You see, Poseidon didn't just control the ocean and create giant whirlpools of doom, he was also the god of earthquakes. In fact, it was one of his titles, Poseidon, Earthshaker. While you might think this was a metaphor, it was not. Poseidon could literally make the earth tremble with a flick of his trident. He didn't need any fancy gadgets or complicated machinery, just a very short temper and an overwhelming desire to watch things crumble. Now, you may ask, why would Poseidon want to shake the earth in the first place? Was he just bored? Was it a weird stress release method, like some kind of ancient yoga? Except the breathing was replaced with tremors, and the downward dog was replaced with panic-stricken mortals running for their lives. Well, it's hard to say. Poseidon's mood was often, let's say, volatile, and nothing got him going more than the feeling of a good old-fashioned earthquake. He could stir the ground beneath you just to remind everyone that he was indeed a god, and also to remind them that he had control over the earth itself. It's sort of like a guy showing off his new car by revving the engine in a crowded parking lot, except, in Poseidon's case, the parking lot was the entire planet, and the engine was a literal geological disaster. Poseidon's earthquakes weren't just random. Oh no, they were calculated, though they may have seemed unpredictable to mortals. Poseidon was the kind of guy who would walk by a city, see a particularly tall building and think, that's a little too tall for my liking. And then, boom! A tremor would send the building crashing to the ground. If there was an ocean nearby, you could also expect a tidal wave to follow, as if Poseidon was trying to remind everyone that there's always a little salt water involved when he's around. It was a good system, really. Earthquake, then flood. It's like having a fire and a water extinguisher all in one. Of course, there were those who were particularly skilled at dodging Poseidon's tremors, like the clever architects who built their cities on sturdy foundations, or the gods who had the good sense to stay far away from Poseidon when he was feeling particularly moody. But for the most part, mortals just had to deal with Poseidon's occasional outbursts of seismic violence. Sure, some of them thought it was the wrath of the gods, but Poseidon was just the guy who liked to shake things up, literally. Next on Poseidon's list of hobbies was something a little more glamorous: saltwater storms. When Poseidon wasn't shaking the earth, he could be found summoning ferocious storms at sea, demonstrating just how angry he could get. Sure, Zeus had his thunderbolts, but Poseidon had waves. Huge, terrifying waves, capable of sinking ships, drowning cities, and making every sailor rethink their life choices. If Zeus liked to remind people of his power with flashes of light and crackling thunder, Poseidon reminded them with an ocean that could go from peaceful to apocalyptic in 2.5 seconds. For Poseidon, creating storms wasn't just about wreaking havoc, it was also about keeping things fresh. You know how people do a little spring cleaning? Well, Poseidon's version of that was to create a good old-fashioned saltwater storm, and let it cleanse the seas of anything that had overstayed its welcome. Whether it was a ship full of mortals or an island that was starting to look a little too smug with its palm trees and warm breezes. Imagine Poseidon sitting on his watery throne, gazing out at the horizon with a furrowed brow. Maybe he was having a particularly bad day, or maybe he just thought the ocean looked a bit stale. Either way, he'd swipe his trident in the direction of a nearby ship and, bam, a storm would appear out of nowhere. Sailors would desperately try to steer their vessels, but it was no use. Poseidon controlled the waves, and the waves were having none of it. But it wasn't always about sinking ships. Sometimes Poseidon just liked to mess with things a little. You know, a small storm here, a massive wave there, no big deal. After all, what's the point of having control over the entire ocean if you can't create little mayhem now and then? Storms, after all, were Poseidon's way of making sure no one ever got too comfortable. The moment someone thought they could safely sail from one place to another, Poseidon would pop up, reminding them that no matter how skilled they were at navigating the seas, they were still at the mercy of his whims. Of course, let's not forget Poseidon's greatest hobby of all, floods. You'd think that after building and flooding Atlantis, Poseidon would have learned a little something about the whole flooding thing. But no. Poseidon, ever the optimist, was all too happy to keep experimenting with the forces of nature. And sometimes a flood was just the right way to remind people that they were tiny, and that their control over the land was more illusory than they cared to admit. Now, you might be wondering, why did Poseidon flood cities, towns, and entire civilizations? Was it just for fun? Was he simply bored? Was he trying to make a point about how great the ocean was, and how much better it was than dry land? Probably all of the above. Poseidon wasn't exactly the let's sit down and have a civilized conversation type of god. When he had a point to make, he made it by drowning everything in sight. Let's be clear, Poseidon wasn't always the one who intended for things to flood. Sometimes it was an accident. He'd be having a pleasant swim in the Mediterranean, playing with his trident, and then, oops, an entire coast would get flooded. The mortals would panic, run around screaming, and Poseidon would just casually wave his hand and pretend it wasn't his fault. After all, he wasn't trying to flood anything. He was just moving water from one place to another. Sure, it sometimes involved entire cities disappearing beneath waves. But who's counting? You could imagine Poseidon's frustration. How was I supposed to know that would happen? I was just moving the tides. It's not my fault the tides got a little bit enthusiastic. But Poseidon's floods weren't just limited to accidental whoopsies. No, sometimes he flooded areas just to make a point, or perhaps as a reminder that his domain was the sea, and the sea had no boundaries. You build your cities too close to my shores? Poseidon seemed to ask. Enjoy your new oceanfront property? He had an excellent sense of humour when it wasn't drowning people. And then there was Poseidon's signature hobby, rough. Some might call it revenge, but Poseidon saw it as a very necessary and much underappreciated hobby. Nothing got him more excited than the idea of punishing someone, usually mortals, but occasionally gods, if they were too smug for their own good. When someone offended Poseidon, and you'd be amazed at how often that happened, he took it personally. No one got away with crossing Poseidon without some form of watery retribution. even if it meant flooding an entire city or causing a series of disastrous earthquakes just for the sheer drama of it. Whether it was turning mortals into stone, drowning them in storm waves, or simply reminding them that the ocean was a force to be reckoned with, Poseidon knew how to deliver a grudge. No mortal ever said, "You know, Poseidon's anger is a little overrated." The only people who said that were the ones who hadn't been drowned yet. The sea remains, even if worship fades. As the centuries passed, Poseidon's name began to fade from mortal tongues. The great cities that once reverenced him began to shift their focus to other gods, perhaps because Poseidon, as it turns out, wasn't always the most practical god to worship. Sure, he could flood your house, drown your crops, and shake the earth to its very core, but when it came to offering assistance in things like, say, everyday life, Poseidon wasn't exactly a go-to god. While Zeus was busy throwing down thunderbolts and ruling over sky and weather, Poseidon was far more content stirring the oceans into a frenzy. "Don't call me unless your entire city is under a wave," he might have grumbled. And so mortals turned their attention elsewhere. But Poseidon, being the eternal god he was, didn't particularly mind the loss of earthly praise. Sure, it might have stung at first when he found out that a group of mortals had started sacrificing to Apollo for a good harvest instead of him, but he quickly shrugged it off. The sea, after all, remained. Oceans still roared, whales still swam, waves still crashed. What need did he have for a few incense offerings or a couple of sacrificial goats when the sea was already doing such an excellent job of reminding people of his power? In fact, Poseidon probably preferred it this way. The ocean, after all, was a bit more loyal than the mortals he'd spent millennia trying to impress. The sea didn't forget. The sea didn't stop worshipping. The sea, unlike the fickle mortals, didn't need constant praise to keep flowing. It just was. And Poseidon, being Poseidon, appreciated that. It wasn't as though Poseidon was outright neglected. In some regions, people still threw him the occasional offering. But as cities grew and empires expanded, people started gravitating toward gods who were, frankly, a little more useful. They wanted gods who could help them win wars, secure fertile crops, or win that last-minute race at the Olympic Games. Poseidon, bless him, was not particularly helpful in those areas. What could he offer in a world that demanded practicality? Sure, he could stir the sea into a frenzy and ruin a navy's entire supply of fresh fish. But how was that going to help you win a harvest festival? How did that make him a top contender for most useful god of the year? At least Apollo could send a few rays of sunshine for crops, and Hermes could assist with trade and travel. But Poseidon, the best he could do was make sure you didn't sink halfway through your voyage, or, flood your entire city and leave you looking like a very wet fool. It was a niche skill, really. As the centuries went by, mortals turned to other gods for practical matters. The temples dedicated to Poseidon started to crumble, slowly overtaken by the encroaching winds of time. Where once priests would recite long, elaborate rituals to ensure Poseidon's favour, now you could find a more crowded temple dedicated to Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and also the goddess of, being helpful. Mortals stopped sacrificing livestock at his feet. They began to turn their attention to more relevant deities, gods who might assist them in their more immediate problems, like how to stop getting struck by lightning or how to get better at growing barley. But for Poseidon, it was never about the mortals' fickle devotion. He knew something they didn't. The sea didn't need their attention. It didn't need their praise. It didn't care if you built a statue of him in your city centre, or if you left out bowls of olives in hopes of soothing his temper. The sea had been there long before mortals, and it would be there long after. Whether or not they worshipped him didn't change the fact that he was the king of the oceans, the ruler of earthquakes, the master of all things that touched water. Poseidon could be forgotten by mortals, and still the sea would roar. Poseidon's decline in popularity wasn't a dramatic one. There wasn't some grand moment where the world suddenly turned on him. It was more of a gradual thing. It's as though mortals started figuring out that they didn't need Poseidon's approval to continue existing. They built roads, constructed aqueducts, and found ways to live without constantly fearing the sea's wrath. And yet, Poseidon remained right there in his domain. In the depths of the ocean, where nothing and no one could touch him. He had long since stopped caring whether or not his name was being sung in the streets of Athens. The sea was his temple now, and it was a far more reliable one than any marble structure could be. He still caused a ruckus when he felt like it, of course. There were still earthquakes. There were still sudden storms that surprised sailors. And from time to time, Poseidon still really enjoyed messing with anyone who dared get too cocky about their ability to control nature. But he had learned to enjoy the quieter life, living in the depths of the ocean, creating chaos only when absolutely necessary, and mostly just watching the world go by. Perhaps Poseidon's greatest revelation came when he realized that his glory, as it was, didn't lie in mortal worship. No, Poseidon's glory was eternal because the sea itself was eternal. Worship might fade, temples might decay, but the ocean didn't need validation from anyone. It would churn and rise regardless of what mortals thought. For all the attempts to replace him with new gods who could actually be helpful in daily life, Poseidon simply outlasted them. And the sea, with all its mystery, danger, and beauty, would never stop being a part of the mortal world. Even if no one was offering him sacrifices, the tides still turned, the waves still crashed, and Poseidon, as always, was still there, underneath it all, just waiting for someone to come along and annoy him enough to trigger another earthquake or flood. In the grand scheme of things, Poseidon was perfectly content. The mortals may have moved on, but he had always known that the sea was more enduring than any fleeting human devotion. Poseidon, after all, didn't need to have his name chanted in the streets to feel powerful. The ocean was his true temple, and it was eternal. And while some gods might have been worried about their diminishing followers, perhaps starting to worry about their relevance in the grand scheme of the universe, Poseidon just sat back and enjoyed his quiet reign over the watery depths. He knew that the mortals, ever fickle, would never stick with any one god forever. They'd worship him when they were in need and forget him when things were good. But the sea didn't forget. The sea didn't care about mortal worship. Poseidon would continue to shake the earth and flood cities as he pleased. But as the years went by, he learned to let go of the need for validation. The sea was more than enough for him. It always had been. So, The next time you're walking along the beach and feel that familiar breeze, remember this. Poseidon may not be the go-to god for your harvest or your Olympic triumphs, but he's still there. The ocean remains, whether you remember his name or not. And as for Poseidon, he's probably content to let mortals do their thing while he enjoys his waves, his storms, and his well-deserved break from constant adoration. After all, the sea will always have a way of reminding people who's really in charge, whether they've thanked him recently or not. And so ends the tale of Poseidon, the god whose temper could raise the seas and whose domain could bring down entire civilizations in the blink of an eye. Whether worshipped or forgotten, Poseidon will always have the sea, and the sea will always have him.